Hello, my name is Amir and I'll be your tutor for the topic writing XML files. This is a second part tutorial. The first part obviously was reading XML files, and you can find both of my tutorials on YouTube. You can search for reading XML files by Amir Mirza, or you can search for writing to XML files by Amir Mirza. Now, before I begin discussing about how XML files are written, just a brief tutorial or brief statement on what XML file is. XML file is essentially a text file with user-defined data types. For example, the data is encapsulated inside open and close tags, which look something like this. So you have a tag called you have a tag called book author, and basically the name of the author after that, and then there's a closing tag for the book author denoted by a / and then book author again. Now the question is that what kind of information can be written to XML files? Now there is no rule per se. Any kind of information can be written to XML files. However, which information is more efficient or would make more efficient writing to XML files? Now, the way I have come to understand is, and again, it is is a topic where people would debate me on it, is that any information which can be represented as text, whether it's weather information or an airline timetable, any human readable information can be represented in XML. Now the information which is hard to represent in XML is image formats. For example, the pixel data which is there to create images, or floating point numbers which create audio files, for example, are best suited for binary format, and that would be a tutorial for a future lecture, I guess. I would love to talk about binary files and how they are created, but for now let's concentrate on creating XML files and how they're written. Again, first what we need to do is get hold of this API from www.exom.nu. Once you have done that, you basically download it to the Netbeans IDE. For people who have got who do not know how to install third-party libraries in Netbeans, essentially what you do is that when you unzip any library file, you get a jar file, which basically is a compressed zip file. So what you go into tools, then you will select libraries and a new library, and then you can call it whatever you like, and there's the choice there, server libraries and class libraries. I'm not going to go into the difference. Just to give you a brief introduction, if you're writing Java applications which have got nothing to do with web services or web, then you're safe to choose the library type as a class library, and you can call it whatever you like. Once you have done that, like in my case, I've got this library imported as Exom, and it points to a jar file here. What it allows is that it allows this jar file, a library, to be used inside Netbeans. Now, in my case, what I want to do is show you how a shopping cart object, again, for people who do not know what an object is, I would say to look it up on Google, and Java objects or C++, what Java objects are or what C++ objects are. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to write a shopping cart to an XML file. A shopping cart essentially is what you can think of it as a basket which has got items inside it, and of course somebody is carrying that basket. So the shopping cart belongs to a particular person, in our case a particular user. So what we do is we start off by again creating a root element. XML file, just to give you a recap, are represented in the form of trees. Just like a tree has got a stem and then the stem branches off into many branches, so does an XML file. This is the representation of what an XML file looks like. Basically, you start off with a root element. In our case, the root element is a shopping cart, and then you branch off into items. And this time I'm going to talk about attributes, because this particular XML file really cannot be created without going into an attribute. Attribute in our case is the person who the shopping cart belongs to. So we start off by saying that we start off with a new root element. Now again, for people who do not know how to get this going, essentially what you need to do is import this. This is basically the namespace under which XCOM libraries are written. So you have to import it to be able to use it. Once you've imported it, excuse me again, you should be able to access all the APIs offered by this. So what you need to do is start off with the root element, and the root element is called shopping cart. Now here is things become not so much tricky, but you just have to pay attention to details. What you need to do is add an attribute to it. And of course, since an attribute doesn't necessarily have to be textual in nature, it could be another node. So what you have to do is, to the root element, you add an attribute, new attribute. In our case, what we want to do is attribute is a variable and a value associated with that variable. So in our case, we start off by saying this shopping cart belongs to this user. So what we need to do is the ID of the user, and then we are just using an internal API to get the ID. Same with the password, same with the name, same with the address, same with the status. Now status again is something user defined. What I found is the best way to use XML files, to read them, write them, is to represent XML files as they were objects. So what you do have to do is that when you read an XML file, all you have to do is read it into an object. As soon as you read that file into an object, you basically get a functional object. Same with saving XML files. All the data and functionality in object encapsulates inside it. If you can write it to an XML file, that is the best way of dealing with XML data. Now, I'm not saying that is the only way of dealing with XML data, but this is one of the way I find very useful. It allows me to create code which is modular in nature, and like things in nature where atoms come together to form molecules and molecules come together to form complex shapes. Same with programming. You would find that the more simpler modular code you write, you would find that it's easier for you to program, and it will be easier for you to bring these small simple components together to form complex programs which are very user friendly or can do complex tasks. So let me get back to the tutorial at hand. So what we do is basically we start going through these attributes. So we say that shopping cart has the following attribute, belongs to a particular person, and we get the value of the particular person and add them as an attribute to the root element of the shopping cart. Then what we want to do is that we actually have an object called shopping cart. In shopping cart there is an array list. Again, array list is a dynamically expanding array of shopping items, because you got one person, it has got a one-to-many relationship with the shopping items. For example, you got one person, but he might have about 10 or 12 or 13 or 14 whatever things. So shopping carts would hold all those items. So what we do is, again, for the sake of consistency, we create the name for whatever root elements, for whatever child elements we want to create. We want to call the root element the same. So when we are reading the code, it's easy for us to read. We can just read the code and say, okay, this element belongs to the book name. So what we are saying is that we are looping through all the shopping items contained in a shopping cart. So we say that we have a book name and we create a child element for book name. We basically have a book author, book price, and the thing is that I'm not going to emphasize too much on what's going on here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on this code. You can freeze it and have a look at it, how it's done. But essentially what happens is you start creating child elements. And you keep creating child element, and every time you create a child element, you have to append it to the root, basically. So root element is connected to all other child elements as if it was a tree. And what you do, you create a book name, get a value into it, and then basically put it down into the root element. You keep going and you do it for all the shopping items in this shopping cart. Once you have come out of this loop, no matter how big this loop is, it could have 5 items or 500 items, essentially the things are not going to change. And what you need to do is that every XML file is represented as a document. So once you have created your root, you have associated child elements to the root you have created, new attributes. What you need to do is you pass the root element, root object into the document. So basically we start with document doc, just a variable name, and create a new document and pass the element. Now the thing is that once you get proficient in Java or any other language, whether it's C++, you'll be able to read the API and basically use the API as it was intended by the people who created it in the first place. Then what you need to do is, once all of this is created, you say there's a method called toXML. So what it does is the elements now would be converted to a text-based XML file, and you put a string. So it says a string, and again, since a string is a dynamically expanding array of bytes, you can basically say that this string is equal to the toXML method from the document object. Now, what you need to do once you've got this string, you basically create a file object and basically give it a name. In my case, the file object, the name of the file object is essentially the user ID plus XML. Then what you do is you create a file output string object and pass the file object into it. And finally what you do is you convert the string into an array of bytes. For those people who do not understand what byte is is an 8-bit long integer. So basically what it means is that maximum amount of value which can be represented inside a byte is from 0 to 256. So all programming, all objects, all TEF files are made up of array of bytes. Essentially what they are, anything in computer programming, whether it's an executable file or an image file or a text file, at the end of it, all it is an array of bytes. So what you do is you write those array of bytes into the string, and once you've written it, you can close the string. And of course, in this piece of code, there's always a chance of an error. So what you do is you put it in a try and catch block. And what could be the error? The error is most likely that the file you're trying to create is not created. And that happens when you are on an operating system or in a directory where you do not have write access, for example. In my case, I do have write access because I'm working in my documents. So I do have write access, but it's a good thing to have, because what will happen is if there is an error, if the file is not being able to be created, then it traps the error. Again, it's always a good idea that wherever you feel there is a chance that an error would be created, it is always a good idea to put it in a try and catch block, because at the end of the day when the application runs, it does not crash the Java machine. It just gives you a user-friendly error saying, well, your file could not be created, or this object could not happen, or this could not happen, and gives a user-friendly message back to the user. And essentially, once you have done that, you can basically call this method. Now, this method is specific. It creates a very specific XML file. It's not a generic representation of an XML file. What it does is it creates an XML file which encapsulates the user and the shopping cart together and shopping items in a singular. And for those people who want to know what this XML file looks like once it's written, it looks like this. It basically starts off with a shopping cart with attributes. The attribute is the ID of the user, the password, the name, and the email. And again, since XML is user defined, you can put any amount of information is there. Or I would say to you is that any amount of information is necessary to encapsulate all the objects in your programming should be put there. And once we have created this attribute, we basically have got individual elements. So each individual element represents the shopping items inside the shopping cart. And of course, you can use my first tutorial to read the shopping cart and create a new shopping cart from it. Essentially, the concept of XML is this: to be able to convert objects into an XML, store them, and when need be, to be able to read those XML files and convert that information back to a usable object. Thank you for listening.